Good morning.
Good morning.
That was the corporate business walk. And she tells me and my wife we cannot afford her. She charges by the 6.5-minute interval.
Oh.
So, there you go. What can I tell you? Listen, my children, and you shall hear the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man or woman is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, "If the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the North Church Tower as a signal light. 1, if by land, and 2, if by sea, and I on the opposite shore shall be ready to ride, and to spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm for the country folk to be up and to arm." Then he said, "Good night," and with muffled oar silently rowed to the Charlestown shore. Meanwhile, impatient to mount and ride, booted and spurred with a heavy stride on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side, now gazed at the landscape far and near, then impetuous stamped the earth, and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched with eager search the belfry tower of the old North Church. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, to the bridle he turns, but lingers and gazes till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry of hoofs in the village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath, from the pebbles in passing, a spark struck out by a steed flying fearless and fleet. That was all. And yet through the gloom and the light, the fate of a nation was riding that night. And the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. You know the rest. In the books you have read how the British regulars fired and fled, how the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall. So through the night rode Paul Revere. And so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear. A voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore, forborne on the night wind of the past, through all our history, to the last in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people will waken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Or William Dawes, as the case may be. You may have heard of the other gentleman. Now, you know those words, and you recognize the little picture, the silhouette of Paul Revere up here, I'll bet you. This was one of the most famous of poems ever written by an American, and the poet in question was Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And on Wednesday, as you heard, we will be celebrating, I hope you all have a candle ready to light, the 206th anniversary of his birth. Now, why should we care? Well, partly because he was the most popular American poet of the entire 19th century. Probably the best loved of American poets the world over, who composed marvelous poems of lasting significance, but also, well, partly because he was a Unitarian and married to a Unitarian. Now, perhaps you already know that we have 2 of his poems in our hymnal as songs. They are number 288, All Are Architects. We don't do that one very much. But then there is the much more well-known 240, I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. Its plea for peace on earth, goodwill to all, has made it an eternal favorite. Now, the first Longfellow came to America in 1676 from Yorkshire, England. Among the ancestors on the poets, of the poet on his mother's side was John and Priscilla Alden, of whom he wrote The Courtship of Miles Standish. Now, his mother's father had been a general in the Revolutionary War, his own father was a lawyer. The Longfellow home represented the graceful living which was beginning to characterize that age. Henry himself was born February 27, 1807, in Portland, Maine. Portland, you know, is a seaport, and a variety of people and the activity of the harbors stirred the mind of this young boy and gave him a curiosity about life much beyond his own immediate experience. He was sent to school when he was only 3 years old. And from the beginning it became quite evident that in this boy there was a drawing, an urge to move toward the sound of words and toward writing. His mother read aloud to him and his brothers and sisters the high romance of Ossian, the legendary Gaelic hero. Cervantes' Don Quixote was a favorite among the books that he read, but the book which influenced him most was Washington Irving's sketchbook. Irving was an American author for whom the native Indian legends and landscape were sources of great inspiration. Now, Longfellow's father was eager to have his son become a lawyer. But when Henry was a senior in college at 19, the college established a chair of modern languages. As soon as he graduated, Henry asked to become the first professor of that chair, and he was given that assignment with the understanding that he would first spend a period of time in which he would travel and study in Europe. And so in May of 1826, the fair-haired youth with the azure blue eyes set out for Europe to turn himself into a scholar and into a linguist. Now, he had letters of introduction to men of great note in England and in France, but he also had his own ideas about how to travel. And so between conferences with these great individuals, he walked from place to place, carrying with him a little silver flute in his pocket, which he would play upon to strike up conversations with anyone along the way. And so it was that he traveled in Spain, in Italy, France, Germany, and England. And then he returned to America in 1829, and at 22 he launched his career as a college professor. Now, much tribute is due to him as such a teacher, because at that time he had to create his own textbooks, which he did. He opened to his students and to the American people the literary heritage of Europe. He created in them the new consciousness of a literature that was now emerging from Spain, from France, and Italy, and especially the new writings that were now emerging from the German, Nordic, and Icelandic cultures. And then in 1831, as you saw a picture earlier, he married Mary Storer Potter, whom he had known as a schoolmate. When he saw her at church upon his return to Portland, he was so struck by her beauty that he followed her home. But he never found the courage then, that day, to speak to her. Nevertheless, somehow they got together and got married, and as husband and wife, they settled down in a house surrounded by elm trees. He expended his energies on translations from Old World literature. He contributed travel sketches to the New England magazine, and in addition, he served as professor and librarian. Now, in 1834, he moved from the little college where he started to a professorship at Harvard. Maybe some of you have heard of that. And once more, to prepare himself, he set out for Europe by way of preparation. And this time, his young wife accompanied him, but unfortunately, the journey ended in tragedy because in Rotterdam, she died. Now, one of the poems of his speaks to such moments. You may know it. It is entitled, "The Rainy Day." The day is cold and dark and dreary. It rains, and the wind is never weary. The vine still clings to the moldering wall, but every gust the dead leaves fall, and the day is dark and dreary. My life is cold and dark and dreary. It rains, and the wind is never weary. My thoughts still cling to the moldering past, but the hopes of youth fall thick in the blast. The days are dark and dreary. Be still, sad heart, and cease repining. Behind the clouds is the sun still shining. Thy fate is the common fate of all. Into each life some rain must fall. Some days must be dark and dreary. And so it was that Longfellow came home to Cambridge and his new professorship. The lonely man took a room at the historic Craigie House. And I notice my spelling's different than yours. I don't know the reason. But anyway, I have an IE in all of my sources, so I'm not sure about that. But the historic Craigie House, where, by the way, General George Washington and his wife had once lived. Now, it was owned by a Mrs. Craigie, who we are told was a very eccentric woman, who kept very much to herself and was quite openly scornful, apparently, of all the young men to whom she had to let rooms. Nevertheless, she had good points. She read widely and she read very well, and her library contained complete sets of Voltaire and other French masters. Longfellow entered this beautiful old elm-encircled house as a lodger, not knowing that this was to become his home for the rest of his life. In time, it passed into the possession of Nathan Appleton, and 7 years after he came to Cambridge, Longfellow married this man's daughter, Frances Appleton, and Craigie House was given to them as a wedding present. Meantime, in the 7 intervening years, he remained a rather romantic figure in Cambridge with his long flowing hair and his yellow gloves and his flowered waistcoats. He worked, however, with very great determination and industry, publishing Hyperion, a prose romance that foreshadowed his love for Frances Appleton. And he published The Voices of the Night, his first book of poems, which included a psalm of life, which became immediately very popular. It goes this way. He wrote, "Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream. For the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was not spoken of the soul. Not enjoyment and not sorrow is our destined end or way, but to act, that each tomorrow find us farther than today. Art is long, and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still, like muffled drums, are beating funeral marches to the grave. In the world's broad field of battle, in the bivouac of life, be not like dumb, driven cattle. Be a hero in the strife. Trust no future, however pleasant. Let the dead past bury its dead. Act, act in the living present, heart within and God o'erhead. Lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing, leave behind us footprints on the sands of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing, shall take heart again. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing. Learn to labor and to wait." And so it was that he journeyed again to Europe, returning to be married in 1843. Now, the marriage was a very happy one, and the Longfellow house became the center of life in the university town. The old Craigie House was a shrine of hospitality and of gracious living. The young people of Cambridge flocked there to play with the 5 Longfellow children, 2 boys and 3 girls, whom the poet described in his poem, The Children's Hour. Now, you may not know that one, but I'll bet you know this one. There was a little girl who had a little curl right in the middle of her forehead. When she was good, she was very, very good indeed, but when she was bad, she was horrid. Thank you. In 1841, Longfellow published another book of poems, and it contained the very famous The Wreck of the Hesperus. It swept the nation in its popularity. And then his And from it, in 1847, Henry published one of his most popular poems, Evangeline. The original story had Evangeline wandering about New England in search of her bridegroom, but Longfellow extended her journey through Louisiana and the western wilderness so that she finds Gabriel at last dying in Philadelphia. Now, Longfellow began to feel that his teaching was hindering his writing, and so in 1854 he resigned from Harvard and gave himself entirely to what he described as the joyous task of poetry. In June of that year, he began the Song of Hiawatha. You remember these famous lines, "On the shore of Gitche-Gumee, on the shining big sea water." I'll bet some of you have read the whole thing. Anybody? I'm proud of you. Now, a book on Indians and several meetings with a chief provided the background for this. The very, very long poem begins with the Great Spirit commanding his people to live in peace and tells Hiawatha how Hiawatha is born. It ends with the coming of a white man and Hiawatha's death. The publication of Hiawatha caused tremendous excitement. For the first time in American literature, Indian themes gained recognition as valid sources of imagination, of power, and of originality. The appeal of this poem and the love of it has lasted to this day in generations of children and young people. It has found a lasting place in world literature. Now, the tale of John Alden and Priscilla came next to Longfellow's mind, and so the courtship of Miles Standish was published in 1858. 25,000 copies of that were sold during its first week of publication. And 10,000 copies were ordered in London on the first day of publication. But then tragedy struck in 1861 when Longfellow's second wife died of burns which she received when packages of her children's curls, which she had been sealing with matches and with wax, burst into flame. Longfellow was devastated. He found some solace in the task of translating Dante into English, and once again he went to Europe for a change of pace. The years following were for him filled with honors of all sorts. He received honorary degrees at the great universities of Oxford and of Cambridge. He was invited to Windsor Castle by Queen Victoria. He was called by request to visit upon the Prince of Wales. He was chosen to be a member of the Russian Academy of Sciences and of the Spanish Academy. And on his 70th birthday in 1877, Longfellow was celebrated throughout these United States. In the poem, as you may recall, The Village Blacksmith, Longfellow had written a couple of lines. Under a spreading chestnut tree, the village smithy stands. They caught everybody's imagination. And sadly, one day it became necessary to remove that tree, and something marvelous happened. The children of Cambridge gave their pennies to build a chair out of that tree, which they then gave to Longfellow. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow died on March 24, 1882. In mourning him, Van Wyck Brooks said, "Of all the sons of the New England morning, he was the largest in his golden sweetness." Literary historians claim that there are two reasons for the popularity and the lasting significance of Longfellow's poetry. First of all, he had, they say, the gift of easy rhyme. He wrote poetry as a bird sings, with natural grace and melody. Read or heard once or twice, his rhyme and meters tend to cling to one's mind. And secondly, Longfellow wrote on obvious themes which appeal to all kinds of people. His poems are very easily understood. They sing their way into one's consciousness. And above all, there is a joyousness in them, a spirit of optimism and faith in the goodness of life, which evokes immediate response in the emotions of his readers. And somehow, it seems Longfellow understood all of this about his own art of poetry. Perhaps that was why he said the following in one of his poems entitled, "The Day is Done." The day is done, and the darkness falls from the wings of night as a feather is wafted downward from an eagle in its flight. I see the lights of the village gleam through the rain and the mist, and a feeling of sadness comes o'er me that my soul cannot resist. Come, read to me some poem, some simple and heartfelt lay that shall soothe this restless feeling and banish the thoughts of day. Not from the grand old masters, not from the bards sublime, whose distant footsteps echo through the corridors of time. For like the strains of martial music, their mighty thoughts suggest life's endless toil and endeavor. And tonight, I long for rest. Read from some humbler poet whose songs gushed from his heart as showers from the clouds of summer, or tears from the eyelids start, who through long days of labor and nights devoid of ease still heard in his soul the music of wonderful melodies. Such songs have the power to quiet the restless pulse of care and come like the benediction that follows after prayer. Then read from the treasured volume the poem of thy choice, and lend to the rhyme of the poet the beauty of thy voice. And the night shall be filled with music, and the cares that infest the day shall fold their tents like the Arabs and as silently steal away. Let us, therefore, be thankful for the life and the poetry of Unitarian Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Amen.